Hello, everybody. It's good to be with you again for this Thursday discussion of the book How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. We're getting ready to cover the chapter on prophets. We'll have a couple more chapters to do, and we'll be done with this book. And we'll talk about what we're going to do in the future at a later point. But right now, about concerning the chapter on the prophets, I want to do 2 weeks on this chapter. Now, this week, I'm basically going to cover basically the material that's in the chapter itself. And then next week, I want to give you an example of how to apply some of this stuff concerning Isaiah 7 and into the beginning of chapter Isaiah 8. So we'll be doing that next week. But this week, we will just be dealing with a material that was presented in the book itself. So I'll be going over this again next week. So if you didn't get a chance to read, I believe it's chapter 10. Make sure you read it by next week. There's a lot of good information there. First, as we think about prophets, Old Testament prophets, we have to understand that there are non-writing prophets and there are writing prophets. And when we start thinking about writing prophets, we need to think about what era of time. In fact, really, we need to think about the era for all the prophets. But for the writing ones, since we use those more to talk about, some Old Testament relationship examples between God and Israel or something to that effect, where it sets that in historical timeline, what's going on there is really, really important. Some of the non-writing prophets, they are called prophets, but they are non-writing, are Elijah and Elisha and Nathan. Now, Nathan was worked in the reign of David, and then Elijah and Elisha are in the northern kingdom, and so they're non-writing, but we have quite a bit of material about those, so we know quite a bit about those three characters for sure. There are some others, Gad, Huldah, and sometimes some of them are called seers, and it's Micaiah is another one that's called a prophet, I believe, but they're really, really minor, and they only show up in very small pieces here and there. But there's more material for Elijah, Elisha, and Nathan. Some of the writing prophets, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, 12 minor prophets at the end of the Old Testament. So now it's important to understand as far as the writing prophets, and all of it's important too, but especially for the writing prophets, is that there is a specific era of Israelite history, or later on Jewish history, that is important in that prophetic ministry. Let's put it that way. So there are certain distinctions that are going on with Israel as a whole kingdom. That would be where the non-writing prophets Nathan's working. Elijah and Elisha are working in the northern kingdom. So you need to know about when the kingdom of Israel was divided into two kingdoms, and then realize that when it is separated into two kingdoms, which happens after the reign of Solomon, so 2 generations after David, basically the kingdom splits into two, and the northern kingdom retains the name Israel. So you've got to know where you're at in history. If you see the term Israel later on in the Old Testament history, you've got to understand it's talking about the northern kingdom and not a united kingdom. So it's important that you understand how this terminology is used in specific eras. Now, also the northern kingdom sometimes is called Ephraim, Ephraim, Ephraim. That's one of the sons of Joseph. It ended up being a leading tribe in the northern kingdom, and so it kind of became the label for the entire kingdom. So the southern kingdom is called Judah. That's why earlier I talked about later Jewish history, and that's where we get the term Jude. Jew is a shortened form for Judean or Judite. So they shortened it to just say Jew. Now that doesn't happen until much later in Israelite or Hebrew history. Let's put it that way. So later on, when you're dealing with the southern kingdom, after the northern kingdom is gone, I'm going to give you some dates in a minute. There's a southern kingdom that remains, and it's called Judah. And then later on, in Judah's history, that name will be shortened to Jew. So when we get to the New Testament, it's just all Jews. Basically, it's saying they're all from the tribe of Judah or associated to something to that effect. So they're the last, basically, of the Jewish people or of the Hebrew people in that area. Now, they're dispersed. Hebrew people are dispersed quite a bit through Old Testament eras. So there's many more Jewish people, or Hebrew people, if I can get my terminology correct, around the Mediterranean area. 722 BCE is an important date. That is when the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed. So the northern kingdom of Israel is no longer after 722 BCE. And so then we enter into a time frame where we're just talking about the southern kingdom of Judah. So the southern kingdom of Judah persists until 586 BCE. So that is what, about 140, 130 years after the destruction of the northern kingdom. They last another 140 years. There's different periods to think about inside of that Judean history. So you need to think about a time that before they go into exile. So at 586 BCE is when the Jewish people go into the southern kingdom of Judah, basically goes into exile into Babylon. So in between 722 and 586, you have what's called a pre-exilic period, or a time before they went into exile. And there are prophets that are working in that time frame. Then you have prophets that are working during the exile period or the exilic period. And then there's a time frame when they come out of exile, out of Babylonian exile, and that's post-exile or post-exilic, and there's prophets that work in that. So there's layers to the eras of history where these people are working. But it's critical that you understand where in history they are working so you can have a good understanding of what's going on. So you need to know, what is prominent, what is the prominent threat for these people during, many of these time frames in history. So early it's Assyria. Later on it's Babylon, and then it's Persia. So knowing about these enemies that are plaguing Israel is also important. So there are lots of things to recognize here. So some of the prophetic ministries and how they fit into certain periods. Okay, so in the United Kingdom of Israel, before everything breaks apart. So we're talking about a reign of Saul, a reign of David, and a reign of Solomon. After that, things break up. So about I think 120 years, somewhere around there, there's a United Kingdom. There are people that are working as spokespersons for God. Let's put it that way. At this time frame, we call them prophets. Samuel would be the first one. Samuel's kind of unique in that he was a judge first, and then he became a prophet. But he is, I consider him a prophet. So Samuel would be one of these that during this time period, and Nathan. Now, there's probably some other minor ones, but those are the prominent ones. Now, after the kingdom is split, after Solomon's reign, when Solomon dies, the kingdom splits. You have the northern kingdom of Israel. And in that northern kingdom, you have Elijah and Elisha. They don't write. And then later on, writing prophets for the northern kingdom, or prophets that work in the northern kingdom that end up being having prophetic writings, let's put it that way, are Hosea and Amos. And so where they fit at, and then knowing a time frame, you can know some of this from just reading some good Bible dictionaries. And I've got one I'll give you here in just a little bit. Now, Isaiah is unique and Jonah is unique. I'll come back to Jonah in a minute. But Isaiah is unique in that he bridges the time before the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed and after it. So he lives as the northern kingdom is destroyed and at a beginning point when the southern kingdom of Judah is basically by itself. But his ministry is basically in the southern kingdom. But he does have a few messages for the northern kingdom before their destruction. But most of his ministry is directed to the southern kingdom. Now, there is dispute. I could go into this quite a bit. I'm not going to. But the destruction of the northern kingdom may have more prominence in that book than what a lot of people give it. Let's put it that way. But that's another discussion. But anyway, just understand that Isaiah is unique in that he ministers basically to the entirety of both nations, and then after the northern kingdom is destroyed, he's basically there for the southern kingdom. Some writing prophets for the southern kingdom are Micah, and Micah is interesting. He's also unique in that he is a contemporary. It seems he's a contemporary of Isaiah, but he's more directed towards the southern kingdom. So he's a little bit different than Isaiah. He doesn't seem to have a message for the northern kingdom, mostly directed to the southern kingdom. However, he is a contemporary of the prophet Isaiah. Another writing prophet for the southern kingdom is Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is before the exile, but he basically has a ministry all the way up to the exile, and maybe just a little afterwards. And then you have Habakkuk, which is a contemporary of Jeremiah, and Joel could fit in. Joel's hard to fit in nicely, but maybe in this time frame. So I'm not being exhaustive here. I'm just giving you some good heads up about some of these major ones that we often think about and talk about. Some of the prophets that came after the exile, after the Jewish people are released from Babylonian captivity and come back to the Promised Land. There are some prophets that work at that time too. And these writing prophets are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So they are very, very late in the history of the Old Testament. Now, I said Jonah's unique in that Jonah doesn't really do any ministry in Israel or the northern. He would be a northern kingdom prophet, I think, technically, if you were to give him a label. But he never works in the northern kingdom. He goes to Assyria, to Nineveh, and does some ministry there. So he's rather unique, and I think he's only called a prophet at the very beginning, nothing later. But he never does. My point is, he doesn't minister within the confines of the boundaries of Israel. Let's put it that way. He's doing some other things. So again, it's important to keep this stuff, these time areas, distinct in your mind so that you can differentiate these prophetic writings. One of the books that I was going to tell you about, and I think I have it. I don't know if I guess I didn't write it down. But and what you should do before you read any of these prophetic writings, like the book of Jeremiah, you should read a good article about the book of Jeremiah itself. And so I'm going to give you a resource here that is it's fairly new and very, very reliable. It is called the Dictionary of the Old Testament, the Prophets. So it's a very good book. It's a large book, but it has lots and lots of good material about all the prophetic writings. So before you begin to read any of the prophetic writings, or reading through like Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel, or something else, this information here within this book, this dictionary of the Old Testament prophets, would be very, very helpful for you, for sure. Okay, the role of the prophet. This is where I think people get sidetracked very, very quickly. So first thing we have to understand is that they were covenant advocates for God. So they are sent by God. They are God's spokesperson. They're sent by God because the people have disobeyed. So actually, they're a form of mercy from God towards the people. However, you've got to keep this in mind. If the ancient Hebrew people, Israelite people, would have been faithful and obedient to the covenant, there would have not been a need for any prophets. So the reason why Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all these prophets come about is because the people have violated. They've broken covenant with God. And God sends someone to correct the problem. Now, it's not always the same. Nathan seems to be like a court prophet. It's kind of weird what Nathan does, but it's different. But the writing prophets are much, much different. So again, if the ancient Hebrew people had obeyed the covenant, then there never would have been a prophet to come to advocate for God. So, the first thing that should come to mind is this. So these writings are not meant to give us messianic promises. That was never their purpose. In fact, there are not any there unless the New Testament tells us there's something there. So we have to be very, very careful about this. Again, let me reiterate. If the people had been obedient, the ancient Hebrew people, there never would have been a need for a prophet. So the prophet's purpose is not to give us messianic promises. The purpose of the prophet was to redirect people to obedience to the covenant again. This is critical. Very, very critical. So they would plead God's case against covenant violations by the people. So they would come and say, this is what you guys have done wrong. Now, what the people are doing wrong is much more than just idolatry. This is what it kind of just is a grab bag for everybody when we talk about the Old Testament. It's like the people were worshiping idols. Yes, they were. But many times they were not worshiping idols, and they just weren't being very nice to one another, to other covenant members in the covenant itself. So within the Old Covenant, there were many, many instructions about how people are to behave with one another in the covenant. This carries over in the New Testament. So, for instance, in the Old Covenant, if someone has more wealth than someone else, and they've taken away from someone else, and so there could be social injustice because the poor aren't being taken care of, and some people are hoarding more and more wealth, materials or something to that effect. So many times it's just the way that the people are acting. In fact, the prophet Isaiah in chapter 1 says so, that a lot of the problems that God has with the people, a lot of the charges that he's bringing against you, covenant violations, are about how you're treating one another. Now, many times, they will come and the prophets will come and they'll say that you're being disobedient and there's a need for repentance and there's going to be punishment if not heeded. Now, here's the thing. God didn't need to send a prophet. He's being very merciful by doing so. The Old Covenant, the law of the Torah, remember we talked about that, those three terms are synonymous, was very clear. If you violate, you will be punished. There was no stipulation in there that I'll send you a warning. Will there be a first warning and a second warning and a third warning? Not at all. It just said, God just said, if you violate, you will be punished, period. So the fact that there is a prophetic ministry shows that God had great mercy. So anyway, they're really trying to get the people to repent. Now, they can also come, if there's something great going on, they can proclaim renewal, joy, and harmony in the covenant, but it depends upon the circumstances. But they are God's spokespersons, is what they are. And we need to understand what their primary purpose was, to get the people redirected to the covenant. Now, here's another thing. They were not purely forecasters, future forecasters. In fact, I think a lot of this comes wrong just from the word itself. The way that we understand the word prophet comes from a couple of Greek words, means before speak, as if someone is speaking the event before it happened. However, it could have the idea of before people speak, standing, a presence, a spatial term, not necessarily a temporal term. This is critical when we start to think about these things. And if they do speak something in the future, we have to be very clear. Deuteronomy 18 is very clear that if if the audience that's receiving the message, if they cannot see that message come true, then that prophet that has spoken that message is a false prophet. So the audience has to be able to see this happen. This is critical. So most of the time when these prophets are forecasting, their future forecast may be in the next day or a week, maybe a month. Maybe they may forecast like a conditional kind of idea, like if you do this, then this is going to happen. This will happen, something like that. But they're not forecasting things beyond the lifetime of the audience, because they have to see if it comes to pass or not. Because if it comes to pass, then they know that prophet is true and not false. This is so often misunderstood. So they were not purely forecasters. They're advocates for God. They can forecast things, but it has to be within some kind of a manageable time frame for the audience to be able to evaluate that prophecy. These ministers, one thing here's another thing. Christians just don't do a very good job of handling the Old Testament. Now, I'm not trying to be mean about it or snarky here, but we just cannot take Christian principles and then place them upon the Old Testament, try to understand what's going on. Let me give you a good example. There is an idea of what we would say faith in the Old Testament. I would probably be more happy to translate that kind of idea with loyalty than faith. But anyway, they're synonymous. There's no doubt about it. Faith and loyalty, okay? There's a Hebrew word for it, for sure. But if we were to use that term faith, we have to understand in an Old Testament context, it is much different than it is in a New Testament context. Let me explain. In the Old Testament, it would be trusting in God. Okay? That's it. There's no Christ or no mention of Christ, no understanding of Christ in the Old Covenant. Just trusting in God. When we get to the New Testament, we talk about faith. There's a couple things going on here. It's important about our salvation from the faithfulness of Christ. So we have to be careful about the way we're looking at this term faith in its context and how it's being used in the New Testament. But also it's about, from the person's point of view, it's about our trust that the salvation act by Christ was sufficient to give us right standing with God. So our faith is not in God, even though, it's all embroiled there, no doubt about it, but it's specifically about the salvation act by Christ and its benefit on our behalf. So there are different, same word, but different contexts in the way that they would be understood and should be used and applied. So we have to be careful about applying these Christian principles to the Old Testament. Very, very careful. And because we don't know history very well, sometimes we tend to probably way on the side of trying to apply Christian principles because we just don't have enough information to really do a good lesson or something. But we just got to study more. So we want to be very, very careful about not reading Christian principles into an Old Testament text. It's not a Christian book. It's an Old Covenant book. Christian book is the New Covenant, so be very, very careful in there. So, now prophets ministered at a specific time of history to a specific audience at a point in history. This is very, very important. So there is a specific need that prophet is coming for or coming to address in a point of history. And so we've got to keep that in perspective again and just not just blow through this and try to find some kind of a Christian anchoring. Now, so the Old Testament first, when we start to think about how we're going to understand these texts, we have got to labor. Maybe it is labor. Maybe you're going to have to do a lot of studying. History, so forth. Maybe you have to do some theological readings. It might take a while. You're going to have to labor is what I'm trying to say. If you're having difficulty with this, and history is going to help you out a lot of knowledge of history. But you have got to find some kind of anchoring into that historical, social, cultural life of the Old Covenant, because that's where it begins. It always begins there. In fact, we don't have any kind of idea about what I would say a filling up of more of some kind of situation unless a New Testament writer writes about it. The New Testament writers are not writing about the entirety of the Old Testament. They're only using bits and pieces. Now, we can argue about the extent of understanding those bits and pieces. In fact, I would probably go to the side of understanding large portions of texts that are being brought forward. There's just a few statements, something to that effect. But still, just understand that they are working in a time, and there's an anchoring there in a historical moment, first and foremost, and we've got to find it each and every time, because it is there. It is always there. We don't need to read a messianic intent into an Old Testament text. And don't do it. Don't. Unless a New Testament writer gives you some kind of direction that way. In fact, if you start doing that, if you just start reading some kind of messianic idea into some Old Testament text, you're really going to misunderstand what's going on in so many of those texts. In fact, there was an important statistic in the chapter about future forecasting of the prophets. And I can't remember, it was like 2-3%. It was really, really low numbers about how much the prophets actually give us some kind of an expression or some kind of a discussion or forecasting of some kind of a future event. Very, very minimal, like 2 or 3% in the entirety of the Old Testament. So this is coming from Old Testament scholars who have looked at this a lot. So be careful about the way that you're looking at these texts. You probably are going to have to labor more to understand the historical anchoring. So there's also, as you think about these prophets, there's also an environment that they are working within. So it's important that you understand political information. So I brought up some of these countries before, but these nations like Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Egypt, these are important countries. Knowing where they fit into the political turmoil or the political landscape of the history at that moment is critical. Who is the ancient Hebrew people worried about it? Is it the Assyrians, or is it later the Babylonians, or is it the Persians? What's going on? And Egypt is kind of a nation that's kind of always around in the Old Testament. So some of these have specific time eras. Like, there's a point in history when the Assyrians are completely decimated. 612 BCE, that nation is completely gone. There's a time when the Babylonian kingdom is completely decimated. 539 BCE. There's a time when the the Persian kingdom is decimated. Alexander the Great, I think, is 330 BCE or somewhere around 329. So there's a time frame for all these nations. Now Egypt is just kind of always there. It's mentioned. It doesn't seem to. It is conquered by some nations, but it still has prominence. Let's put it that way. So it would be good for you to know how that particular era fits within that political turmoil. So, for instance, next week I'm going to talk to you about a lot of things going on. So, is there a war going on, or some kind of political difficulty, or who is Israel or Judah trying to find political alliance with? So sometimes they try to make political alliances with certain nations in order to protect them against other nations. So a lot of this keeping straight in your mind is really critical when you're starting to think about many of these things. There's other kingdoms that are important to think about. Obviously, the northern kingdom of Israel, keeping that in perspective in relation to the entirety of at one time when Israel, the entire nation was called Israel, just keeping the differentiation between that time period and the time period of the northern kingdom of Israel. Know something about the southern kingdom of Judah. Know something about some of these other nations that seem to be really, they're minor nations, but it would be good to know some information about them, like Philistia, the Philistines. Know about those people. In fact, they're not really prominent after Samuel, but they are interesting. The Phoenicians, Moab, Edom, Cush, which is a southern country underneath Egypt. So a lot of these countries are very important. Aram or Syria. Now that's not the same as Assyria, but there is sometimes it's called Aram, sometimes it's called Syria. Knowing just a little bit about these places would be just incredibly beneficial. So historical information, when you're thinking about some of this material, just some broad questions when you're thinking about history. How did the people at that time view the world? They didn't have the jet set life. So when we're thinking about these things, how big is a world for a person who can't travel beyond maybe 100-mile radius? Their world is small, very, very small. And they may use the idea of all the world, but again, their world is very, very small. How did the people live at that time? It could be different as you're moving along in the Old Testament. The Old Testament history is vast. So just go from Abraham to Malachi or Daniel. Both of those are really, really late writings. Easily 1,400 or 1,500 years of time there. That's a lot of history. So there may be a differentiation in the way that people live, the way that they raise crops, the way that they did practice war. There's variations going on. So just realize that. How did they live at that time? And then know about the history within a specific corridor of the world. It's called the ancient Near Eastern world. That's what people will be calling it during this time frame. So know that. Also, social cultural practices are always going to be beneficial. Agricultural practices and religious customs would be very beneficial. How are these people practicing their worship of their pagan gods? So Asherah and Baal and Marduk and these others, Dagon, they're going to be important. And so all this information that you can gather is going to help you tremendously when you're looking at these books or reading these writings. So the dictionary of the Old Testament, the prophets, would be very, very helpful. Now, let me just give you some pointers about how to read the prophets, some more information just as you're reading from it. So you already have all your historical information, you're learning it, you're gathering it, you're starting to implement it into your studies. As you start to read the prophets, you need to understand that sometimes it can be a prose or a narrative style of writing. So it'll be blocked in your Bible. Whereas if it's poetic, it's going to be a little bit offset. So if it is a narrative, then we may have to use narrative types of the guidelines for narrative writings to understand. We have to be savvy in the way that we look at these things. We don't read every piece of information the same if the writing style changes. But there are times, when it is a narrative type of writing. In fact, we'll see some of that next week when we go through Isaiah. There's a lot of poetry in the prophetic writings. Poetry makes things more difficult. You have to slow down when you start to read poetry. And you have to use those guidelines associated with poetic literature. So there's exaggeration going on, there's metaphor, there's symbolism, figurative language, so forth, and so on going on in poetic writings. So we have to be able to recognize that and shift gears if we need to. in order to understand what's going on. Also, and this is where I think this chapter did an excellent job, a very, very good job. There are styles within prophetic type of writings. So we just can't throw out the label prophetic writings and stick it on every type of writing that we consider a prophetic writing. It's just not that way. That's just too general, too bland. There are styles of writing within this corpus of writing. Let's put it that way. This corpus of material. So one of the first ones he talks about is the lawsuit. And so, as I said, the prophets were covenant advocates. So they came as God's spokesman and they came to charge the people. Okay? So we often see a lawsuit idea. A covenant is a legal agreement. We have to understand that. This is a legal agreement. It's not a spiritual agreement, even though we think of it as that way. It is a legal agreement, the way that it's put together and the way that it's enforced. So we have lawsuit kind of situations going on. Isaiah chapter 3 he brings up, but also Jeremiah 2 through 4 is an excellent place where we have this lawsuit idea being brought up, where the advocate, the prophet, acts like a prosecuting attorney. And God is not the judge in this instance. God is the one who's pleading through the prophet. And so Israel is the defendant. God and the spokesperson are the prosecutor. And then this is what's so weird. It's the mountains and the hills that are supposed to judge. But the violations are so obvious that there really is no need to judge, because as soon as the prophet lays out his argumentation, it would be like, oh yes, everybody understands that they violated that. But just realize that there are lawsuit, and he calls them oracles, which I really was pleased with. Instead of thinking about paragraphs in the New Testament, we need to think about oracles. So oracles could go for a period of time. Now here's another thing about prophets, as you're thinking about poetry and versus prose style of writing. Another thing, and it's frustrating, I think, to some people. Just realize that these writings are not in chronological. They're not chronologically set up in time-wise anyway. So it's not a chronological occurrence according to a timeline. Sometimes it can be jumbled up according to thematic purpose. Jeremiah is the example, the perfect example of that. Jeremiah does not record events. This happened this day, then the next week this day, so forth and so on, like a calendar. It doesn't work that way. For some reason, whoever compiled Jeremiah, it put it together in some kind of a thematic purpose, and it is kind of hard sometimes to figure out how that theme is carrying through, but it is a thematic purpose. Isaiah is even the same way to some degree. Isaiah 1 through 5 seems to be some kind of an introduction of the whole entirety of the book. And really, his ministry doesn't even start till chapter 6. So it doesn't even follow that chronological, sequential kind of progression that we're thinking. So be aware of that. About oracles again. There's also a woe oracle. That would be where the advocate basically says, this is what's going to happen to you. You're in violation. And so here's the coming punishment. Salvation is there's a restoration that happens. So after the punishment has been fulfilled, the time, whatever is needed, there's a restoration. God restores the people. It's called a salvation oracle. And then also there's a messenger oracle where the Lord actually speaks. The Lord says, and it's as if the prophet is the mouthpiece for God at that time. So there are varying types of styles of writing. Now, you might be scratching your head like, how in the world am I supposed to know the differences? It's not that bad. Real quick, just listen closely. Make sure you read the entirety of an oracle, and you should be able to define the boundaries pretty easily, I believe, because it's going to be pretty obvious that there's going to be a change in some kind of subject matter. So you'll be able to see. It's not going to carry on beyond 4 or 5 chapters for sure. I mean, and many times it's going to be condensed down to maybe like a half a chapter. But be able to recognize that discourse that's set there and the boundaries within it. And so you'll be able to do this just by reading carefully, okay? And as you're reading through it, determine the purpose of that oracle. Now, there is another book that I want to recommend to you, and I don't know if this one would still be in print or not, but man, it is a good book. So it's written by William Van Gemeren. William Van Gemeren. The last name is V-A-N, capital V-A-N, capital G-E-M-E-R-E-N. William Van Gemeren. I had a chance to meet him one time. He's really an interesting guy. But anyway, he wrote this book, and it's called, I have to look at my books over here real quick. called Interpreting the Prophetic Word. Interpreting the Prophetic Word. William Van Geerman. He talks about all these different kind of oracles within prophetic type of writings. He's basically the go-to guy at this point. In fact, this book has been the book to go to for 40, 50 years. So it's really, really good information. So make sure you determine the purpose of those oracles. It may be to charge, which would be the lawsuit. It may be to forecast and punishment. That might be the woe oracle. You don't have to identify them according to the technical terms. Just recognize what's going on there. There may be some kind of a promise of salvation, and then there could be the time when God expresses his disappointment about the people, and that's the messenger. Just make sure that you read with the purpose in mind as you're reading through this. So read slowly, read deliberately, learn the history and the culture that's going on at that time frame, and make sure that you always anchor that in that time frame, because it is to be anchored in that time frame. Okay, that's all I've got for this week. Next week, we will go through prophetic writings again. I'm going to use an example for you and kind of show you some different things as I'm going through. So I'll be looking at Isaiah 8 into the first part of Isaiah 7, into Isaiah 8 next week. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you read chapter 10 of the prophetic writings. All right, have a great day, and I'll see you guys on Sunday. Bye.